beyond. So the Reconstructionists argued the problem was largely with the Siddur, that there had to be changes, perhaps even radical changes in the liturgy. And the response, led by Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, was no. There is indeed a great problem, but the problem is with the prayers, that is, those who pray, their leaders, the rabbis, and not with the Siddur. So that's not we're not going to focus so much on that question, but since 1953, of course, there have been an enormous number of Siddurim produced of various denominational flavors, non-denominational flavors, more or less radical in approach. Mostly, I think, less, actually. If you look at them, I'm not the expert, but it's always remarkable to me how many Siddurim across how many lines preserve essentially the core Hebrew liturgy that most of us have been familiar with for many 100 years, if not longer. So we have 4 eminent critics of what has been going on in the Siddur production world. They come at this from, and I'm not even going to anticipate it because frankly I don't know exactly what they're going to say. I will just tell you each will speak from an interesting and quite different perspective about where we are and where we might be going in terms of liturgy and prayer. And we're going to, bios again are all in the pamphlet. We're going to begin with Rabbi Michael Strassfeld.
Just as I'm putting the microphone in, when at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, as part of the curriculum, we were handed out, we read the Heschels speech to the RA convention, but we read it in the form of the, as it was produced in the proceedings of the Rabbinical Assembly, which not only had Heschel's speech, but it had the responses of the members of the RA to the speech, and in fact, the unrestrained fury of the rabbis who were working hard out in the field, and Feld here was Heschel, the ivory tower professor, telling them how awful their services were, was so bad that they actually they gave Heschel a few minutes at the beginning of the session to basically kind of apologize and say he didn't really mean to, make them, feel, as bad as or as angry as they did. I encourage you actually to take a look at it. It's really, it kind of puts that in its own context. Oh, great. So let me begin. A few years ago in the New York Times Magazine, there was an article provocatively entitled, "Is there a right way to pray?" And I was disappointed by most of the article. It didn't tell me how to do it. But there were a few striking elements that once again confirmed that Jews attend synagogue prayer, synagogue services at a much lower percentage than most Americans. And the question is, why is that? And one answer might be found in the description of prayer from the article by a Baptist minister. I quote, "Let God begin the conversation. Keep your prayers brief and clear. Repeat simple, scripture-based phrases. Pray standing up to fight torpor, and pray directly facing others, eye to eye, in a loud, clear voice." Were someone to describe Jewish prayer, the words brief, clear, and simple would not immediately spring to mind. Instead, the description might read, make sure your Shabbat services are at least 2 to 3 hours long, thereby ensuring people will vote by their feet by showing up an hour late. Have those prayers in a language that most people don't understand or reflect a theology that most people don't believe in. That is the paradox we face. Prayer and services are at the center of what synagogues and minyanim do. So how can something so essential be, in my opinion at least, so unsuccessful in the vast majority of synagogues of all kinds and sizes? It is not prayer books, but praying that is the problem. In that sense, I guess I somewhat agree with Heschel if I'm having to choose. I believe almost all liberal Jews and a good number of Orthodox Jews don't actually believe in a God that answers individual prayers. How many Jews really believe that if they pray hard enough or sincerely enough or often enough, that God will sometimes, just sometimes, answer with a yes? While prayers of request are basically absent from our Shabbat and holiday liturgy, they are essential to the daily liturgy. And I would suggest if we survey most Jews and ask them to define prayer, they would define it as asking or petitioning God. Much of the remaining liturgy is an expression of praise of God. Some of that can be explained as a context for petitionary prayer. First, you praise God, then you ask for things, and then you thank God. That is the classic rabbinic structure of prayer. The metaphor of approaching a flesh and blood king underlies that structure, and of course, that too does not speak to many of us. Therefore, I want to argue that we consider reconstructing prayer. That reconstructing goes beyond better translations or readings, grappling with God language and all the other problems that are experienced in services and that we have spent much of our time talking about. We need to reconstruct prayer so it not only makes sense, but that it is a compelling experience for the worshipers. If we look back in Jewish history, when Judaism made a transition from its biblical period to the rabbinic, there was a sharp change in the form of Jewish worship. With the destruction of the temple, Rabbinic Judaism abandoned sacrifices and the accompanying cult and instead created prayer and synagogues. This was a radical break from the past. Perhaps now we are entering into post-Rabbinic Judaism, where another transition is taking place and radical new forms need to be created. The answer then is not new prayer books, as important as they are. As much as we improve the current form, it still will not work for most Jews, I believe. Let me suggest that in reconstructing prayer, we no longer direct our words to an unanswering God, but rather we see it as a time to focus on our inner lives. One of the ways the rabbis refer to prayer is Avodah, the service of the heart. In our busy lives, services can become an opportunity for self-reflection that brings us back in touch with some of our deeper values that we try to hold on to, but too often slip away, such as the acknowledgement that we are part of a universe larger than ourselves, that we are neither all-powerful nor powerless, that we are unique and yet not alone in the universe. These values can be in relationship to God, that is, I am grateful to you, God, for creating nature, or I feel connected to the oneness that underlies creation, or it can be godless. I feel grateful for community, for my life, for the wonders of creation. Services in this post-Rabbinic Judaism will be important times to reflect on our intention for the past week and prepare for the coming week. The liturgy would give structure and focus to the time. What of the traditional liturgy? It's a difficult question for me. I don't have a full answer. I remain opposed to throwing it out wholesale, but some things are clear to me. There are just far, far too many words. I reject the notion that you have to say a lot of words because you never know which phrase will strike you today. We are just at the beginning of the process of radically re-envisioning prayer. At the SAJ, what we have done the last couple years is use the first 20 minutes of the service to focus on a spiritual theme for that Shabbat, a theme that's developed through the setting out of a kavanah, intention, liturgy that's sung, readings on the theme. This has replaced the Birchot HaShachar and Pesukei Zimra. The question remains, of course, what about the rest of the service from Borchu through the Amidah? Is this notion of Avodat Halev, this turning inward, just another manifestation of the narcissistic qualities of our society, or another form of pop psychology self-treatment? It could be. Everything has within it the possibility of becoming a negative. Yet a key element is that Avodat Halev takes place in community. Though prayer can take place at home by myself, Jewish tradition, as you know, emphasizes that it should take place in a minyan. Why? Because it is important for us to remember our common humanity. The whole world does not begin and end with me, that the inner life is not lived alone in a cave, but rather in the complexity of daily interactions with all those around you. Most of all, we pray together, and mostly in the plural, to remind us that the purpose of prayer is not for you or I to achieve nirvana or sainthood. Rather, Avodah Talev is to enrich our lives so that we can be better positioned to enrich the lives of everyone around us, so that we all live in a more compassionate and caring world. The classic rabbinic categories of Shabbat, praise, bakasha, petition, hoda'ah, thanks, are to be reconstructed. Hoda'ah then becomes the cultivation of the quality of gratitude for all the blessings in our lives. Praise becomes a striving for clarity about our place in the universe. It is, again, not all about you, your triumphs and disappointments. Rather, you, each of us, are part of something larger. You are simultaneously humbled by your smallness and the vastness of the universe, and yet also feel connected to that which is beyond, and thereby you feel not existentially alone. Finally, bakasha is the most radically revised. It is not what you want to be given, but rather who you want to be. You reflect on the midot, the spiritual and ethical qualities that you struggle with. Where is prayer in this description? If you think prayer means asking God for things, then nowhere. If you think prayer provides a way to reflect on our spiritual lives, to give expression to our goals and hopes, to help make the coming week better, then it is all over the place. What is Jewish about this? It is Jewish because Jews are doing it in a synagogue, using verses from Psalms in the prayer book accompanied by Jewish teachings. But mostly I believe it is Jewish because it offers the potential of connection to our deepest, best selves, because it offers the potential of holiness in our lives and even in our world. I believe this is the task of our hour, and the future of synagogues depends upon it. The future of religious life depends on our engaging in a radical re-envisioning of prayer. Thank you.
Next, I'm going to call on Catherine Madsen. As each speaker finishes, please raise your hand if you would like note cards, pencils, or both, because we'll again collect those in a little bit. Catherine?
Well, I don't altogether believe in starting out with a joke, but there was this wonderful New Yorker cartoon that I clipped a few years ago and just rediscovered. And it's the scene in heaven and a couple of guys with wings standing on a cloud talking to each other, and they're a little putty fluttering by in the sky, and then this large robed figure pacing by, and he's got his hair streaming behind him and a prominent nose and really no chin, and the one angel is saying to the other, "I can't take him seriously since he's shaved." And I think this may have something to do with prayer book revision. But seriously, folks, as we were emailing about this panel beforehand, one of Dan's questions to the panelists was, or should we perhaps focus on teaching people how to daven rather than what to daven? And I decided that I didn't think the question is either what to daven in terms of content and how to revise the content, or how to daven in the sort of Heschel sense of spiritual preparation. It's really why to daven. Prayer book committees in recent decades have put a lot of time into adjusting the language of belief, and we still have the same complaints about liturgy. People don't like it for this and that reason. But it seems to me that the mainspring of religious life actually isn't belief, it's trust. What do we trust about a liturgy enough to immerse ourselves in it and use it for years and years? What do we trust about the universe in the first place that we need a liturgy to express it? How do we make ourselves trustworthy people? How do we maintain a trustworthy community? And I would say that the most important question for any prayer book editor or translator or committee isn't what do we believe or what's our constituency and what does it want. It's how do we write a trustworthy prayer book? Now, people who get serious about writing, whether it's liturgical writing or any other kind of writing, eventually figure out that writing is character. It exposes you. It exposes your gaps in understanding and your gaps in competency and your gaps in imagination. And in order to close those gaps, you have to learn to anticipate what the reader will need, what they will ask, what they will argue with if they think you haven't thought about it. And you have to work all that into the structure of the piece. And with a Siddur, this is especially true where original material in English is concerned, whether that's translation, commentaries, supplemental readings, altogether new forms. You have to think it out in terms of its impact. And doing the best you can is not enough. Every writer who works with an editor knows that. Every writer who gets comments from an audience about things they didn't know they said knows that. And there's a lot of doing the best you can in liturgical writing, and it's slovenly. It's full of little lapses in judgment, any one of which can instantly lose the reader's trust. And it's not that every reader is out to get you. It's just that every mind has a built-in crap detector that gets triggered eventually. We want so badly to trust that we're preternaturally responsive to anything that interferes with that trust. Actually, we want so badly to trust that we'll pretend we can trust something that we don't really, written by people who have no idea how to earn that trust. But we don't have to pretend. We can think about and we can try to assemble what it is that we will trust. The reader in confronting a text is always aware of things like this. How are these people talking to you? How are they talking to God? Are they talking to God, or are they telling you what they think you want to hear? Or are they posing in the mirror? Are they speaking with the voice of experience, or are they caught up in some programmatic set of ideas that may actually not stand up to experience? Are they at any point being dishonest or evasive? Do they know how to help you emotionally and morally when you need help? Now, I realize that prayer book committees aren't thinking along these lines, and that people who write prayers in an official capacity never get any critique of this sort. This just isn't how committees operate. And so I want to offer a set of questions that I think should always be in the mind of the liturgist. What does help people emotionally and morally when they need help? And what doesn't? It's not always the most obvious thing. It's not always the thing that bangs you on the head and says, I'm going to help you. It can be something very subtle, and even something that comes from your internal makeup. And you're not saying that necessarily, but you understand that as part of the human makeup. How do we keep from tripping over our own feet as writers? How do we subordinate our ideas to the way real life works, to the contingencies and vulnerabilities that can strike at any time and that demand a very different kind of attention than ideas do? What are we afraid of? Our colleagues' opinion? Our congregants' opinion? What non-Jews will think of us? What the Satmar Rebbe's aunt will think of us? That was always Arthur Green's formulation of, who's keeping everybody in line, from the liberal to the conservative to the frum to the very frum to the very, very frum, and, somewhere the Satmar Rebbe's aunt is watching over what he does. Or are we afraid of those physical contingencies and vulnerabilities that can hurt us worse than any of those other things can hurt us? Are we afraid of God? Are we afraid in neurotic sense, perhaps, or are we afraid in the sense of Yirat Shamayim, thinking that there are things that you should respect, there are things you should be cautious about? Rushing in where angels fear to tread. Are we talking to God? And finally, and most importantly, what kind of people are we trying to make? There's a phrase that struck me long ago in Aviva Zornberg's book on Genesis. It's one of the chapters on Jacob, and she tosses off this extraordinary phrase, the righteous, men and women of special potency. How do we write a prayer book to produce such people? Thank you.
Again, please, thank you, Catherine. Let Seth know if you have questions by raising your hand, and we'll invite up Rabbi Matalon.
Thank you. Good afternoon to all. I reread the address, Heschel's address, that Dan sent to the members of the panel. I had read it more than once, but I had never seen the responses of the rabbis who attended his speech. His speech is very powerful. I've read it many times. Most or many of the points that he makes are incorporated in the book Quest for God. I had never read the responses, and I was shocked by the defensiveness, the feeling of hurt, of deep hurt and insult of the rabbis who had attended his presentation and who responded to him the next day. And I was asking myself all the time, how would I have felt if I would have been in that room in 1953? And I must confess, I think I am over-identified with Heschel, and I still believe that he was touching something very profound which is still with us. And I think, for the most part, it's a failure of the rabbis. It's a failure of the Jewish educational system. It's a failure of the Jewish community in general not to have placed this at the center. I believe that Jewish prayer, Jewish communal prayer, is one of the central activities of a Jewish person in a Jewish community. And not to have placed this at the center of our concern, as Heschel indicates, I think is a major failure, and I think is responsible for a departure from serious prayer from our people. I think it's and I'm not against a proliferation of prayer books. I don't think that this is a dichotomy, too many prayer books, or should we remain with the traditional? Should we have do we have too many prayer books? I don't mind the proliferation of prayer books as long as it is to be able to address and to fulfill a need, a real need and a real thirst in the Jewish people for meaningful prayer. But I think that we have not sustained, we in general, previous generations, our generation as well, and the Jewish community in general has not devoted enough to create and to maintain a prayer at the center of Jewish activity. I believe that from prayer emanate many other things in terms of our agenda, in terms of our vision, in terms of our commitments, our values. Everything, I believe, emanates, is centered and emanates, radiates from the experience of prayer. And I think not having placed prayer at the center, I think has left us as a Jewish community much poorer, much more on the surface, much more superficial, and much more vulnerable to the cultural currents of the individualism and consumerism and all the things that we have experienced and we continue to experience, and which are eating away at the core, the value core of the Jewish community. So I really believe that Heschel was right, and And I think my approach, and we have been trying for quite a number of years, and not always with great success at BJ, to be able to put prayer at the center. I've not really understood until more recently that we need to put a lot more resources in bringing people along, and not everybody is going to be not everybody will be attracted to going a leap deeper into this discovery of the meaning of prayer, why we pray, who we pray to, what is prayer, what is the experience of prayer. Not talking now about the prayer book, I'm talking about the experience of prayer, to be able to open that with congregants, with people, to explore with them what is our longing, what is in our heart, what are we turning to, what's the experience of prayer. Of course, issues of theology, to be able to expose and to open up the questions and the issues and the problems and the obstacles in terms of theology. I realized recently that most people have no idea of the structure of the prayer service and how one section moves into the next and carries into the next one, and so on and so forth, that there's some sort of a development and an inner logic that most people don't know, and it's not intuitive. And we have, I think, failed. I'm talking about Jewish educators and rabbis. We have failed to open that up and to share that and to educate people into how to appreciate, how to develop a sensitivity and sensibility for those for the structure of Jewish prayer, which perhaps in previous generations maybe was more intuitive, maybe it came within the system of Jewish education, or was accessible for people in their experience of Jewish prayer. It no longer is for our generation, and I think we have failed to expose that. I think I just attended a very wonderful session on language and translation, and have we sat with people and opened up, the meaning of the words and open up different translations and explored all the dimensions, all the associations of certain key words that appear in our liturgy. Issues of access. Many people don't, of course, read Hebrew or understand Hebrew, so how are we making our prayer service accessible without making it diluted and superficial? It's a very serious question. I don't have the answer. The question of the cultivation of the inner space during prayer, and to mind Jewish prayer as the opportunity to cultivate the inner experience, the inner space, not just to, a lot of our effort, by the way, has been into making people, to training people to pray adequately, which means just say the words and move through. But we haven't cultivated really what it means to move through with a full engagement of the heart and the soul. So I'm not sure that the answer is shortening, is creating Siddurim where prayer is shortened and losing some of the complexity. By the way, I'm a firm believer that you really can't achieve, and I know Michael and I, Chevruta, we study once a week together, and I know he feels that there's much too many words and the service is too long, and this is, his thing, and I feel you can't get anywhere unless you put the time in and you put the words in, and you have to get yourself through the experience of the many words. I am not I don't attend regularly a gym. I know many people do, and people who do tell me that you don't really get anything out of it unless you spend the time. You can't do it in less than half an hour. In an hour, you have to go through different machines. You have to exercise your upper body, your lower body, different muscles, different machines for different things, your heart rate. I mean, it just doesn't work unless you have a certain structure and you put in the time. And I think that's the words and the time and the length at the end are meant, if done properly, if we invest in them properly and with a proper education and with a proper access, this is what the transformation, this is what makes the transformation possible. You can't do it in half an hour. You can't do it in 15 minutes. You have to get yourself through it in order to be able to shape your heart, or reshape your heart, and which I think this is what prayer is about. I am concerned about destroying, with certain new Siddurim, destroying the inner wisdom of the tefillah, moving from section to section, moving through all those words, taking all that time, and also there is an inner wisdom in the prayer service. It was structured a certain way for a certain purpose, and to begin to take pieces out, I think we risk demolishing something that we also may not understand always rationally. There's something meta-rational, and I am afraid of taking pieces out. Of course, I am all for innovation, that to put fresh prayers in between, and to put piyutim, and to insert kavanot. I think all of that is absolutely necessary, a sense of freshness and innovation. But I think that to take too many pieces out, we are playing, with something that is very dangerous. So I think I'm going to stop here. I think you understand where I'm going. And part of my work over the last several years has been with the work of piyut. And the work of piyut is to be able to bring these exquisite poems of generations, of hundreds of years, some of them from the 10th century, from Rabbi Shlomo ben Gabirol or Rabbi Yehuda Levi, through the work of Rabbi Israel Najara in the 16th century, and even further closer to even poems of the 20th century, to bring them in the tefillah in order to be able to enhance the kavanah, to be able to shed light on the meaning of the traditional prayers of the Siddur, to be able to also with some beautiful musical traditions, in order to be able to get deeper into mine the depth of the traditional prayer. So the piyut work has been at the service of cultivating, illuminating the Siddur, and also cultivating something in the prayer, in the person who prays, to be able to approach the Siddur in a richer way.
Thank you. Last but certainly not least, Rabbi Ed Feld, and again, keep the questions coming. Seth will look for hands.
So I thought I would like to explicate a poem as an introduction to my talk, and if you could get some volunteers to distribute it. We need more people to just quickly distribute it in the back. So it's a poem by a contemporary Israeli poet, Rifka Miriam. She lives in Jerusalem. I want to read it in Hebrew first and then in English. Gadol gibor v'nora amarti. Gadol gibor v'nora amarti. V'shuv amarti. Gadol gibor v'nora. למה שקרה בעבר כיוונתי, גם למה שטרם אירע. ואבותיי שחיים ומתים, וילדיי שנולדו ועוד לא, כל אחד מהם בקולי המדבר נתן את קולו. לא ידעתי אם הדברים שבפי קבלנה הם, או שאלה, בקשה ותחינה, עם שיר של הלל ותודה בוקע ממני, או נהי של קינה, לא ידעתי אם אותה נוצותיות שרפרפה על כתפיי היא חיבוק של קרבה או שרטת צריבה מענה, המרמזת כגדם כנף על הסתלקות השכינה. אך הייתי שבה ואומרת, שוב ושוב ושוב, גדול, גיבור ונורא. חוזרת הייתי ואומרת, חוזרת ושונה. I said, great, mighty, awe-inspiring. I said, great, mighty, awe-inspiring. I said it and I said it again. Great, mighty, awe-inspiring. I was addressing what had happened in the past and also what had not yet occurred. My ancestors who lived and died, and my children born and not born, each one of them sounded their voice in my voice. I didn't know whether the words in my mouth were a complaint, a series of questions, a request, a plea, or if a song of thanksgiving and praise had broken out of me, or a threnodies moan. I didn't know if that feathered tingling in my shoulders was an embrace or a scratch, a stinging response signaling like the stump of a wing the disappearance of the Shekhinah. But I repeated again and again and again, great, mighty, and awe-inspiring. I repeated it again and said it and repeated it again. Rifka Miriam describes her insistence on continuing to pray in a traditional language, despite questions and doubts. Like her, or perhaps even more than her, when we walk into the synagogue and when we begin to pray, we don't have any sense at all of what we may mean by the word God. We certainly do not believe in a divinity that answers prayers, nor do we believe that there is a personality apart from the world who looks down on us, judges us, empathizes with us. In Rifka Miriam's metaphor, and for us too, the Shekhinah may be just a broken stump of a wing, a broken umbrella in the rain. It once offered protection, but now we carry it around uselessly. Yet we go on praying. We may not be able to articulate why, but we hope that something might touch us. Martin Buber has a passage in which he says every human being waits for a yes, waits for something which will affirm them in their being. In Rifka Miriam's terms, we wait for a feather to stroke us. When a prayer works for us, it seems life has meaning, and we experience the world as something we can relate to. The moment of prayer is an awakening of our soul, an awakening of a consciousness of a world that we are related to. The world becomes a field which invites us in to be a responsible partner with it. And this too, prayer takes us beyond the limits of our sensate world to a world of dreams. The religious life captures something not available to us through secular humanism. a depth of existence, a calling. We do not want to give this up simply because these ancient words make us work so hard to give them meaning. We enter the world of prayer in the hope that we might be transported, that this time we might be transformed, that we might be addressed by these words. And so we continue to pray these words, because with them so much more than words come. We are knit into a larger community. We are knit into generations that were and generations that were to come. To cut ourselves off from these words would mean cutting ourselves off from any hope that the spiritual lives of our ancestors can feed us, or that we may have a heritage to pass on to those who go beyond us. The decision not to pray these words, not to pass them on, is too final. And so this is our experience of prayer. We begin with brokenness. We say the words of prayer, and many times we may emerge whole and leave the moment of prayer impelled on our journey. And many times nothing happens to us, but we refuse to give up, and we come back again and again and again.
Thanks to all four of our critics for those wonderfully stimulating remarks. So last call quickly for questions, either by note card. I can't promise we're going to get to them all, but we'll try, or email, again, conference@kaplancenter.org. So if the questioners will indulge me, I'm going to do a little editing right on the spot, a little paraphrasing, and I hope I will do justice to your questions, but in the interest of time, I am going to try to get at the core of them, perhaps in slightly different language. So the first question, which I think touches on a much bigger question, is why do you think that in other religions, apparently Islam, for example, members of the community are much more devoted to prayer practice, while Jews seem less interested in praying, even those affiliated with communities? And I think, of course, this gets at the very big question. I think Catherine's absolutely right. My earlier email failed to look at the why question. I think this goes to that in part. In other words, I've been thinking a lot about the why. What is our goal? Do we want all those Jews necessarily praying? Is prayer really just for those for whom it works, whatever that may mean? Or is there some cosmic significance potentially in terms, every rabbi I talk to will tell you the ultimate goal is tikkun olam in some way, and assuming we're trying to get there, where does this fit in? Or is it really just about making the prayer life of those who seek a prayer life better? And again, back to the technical question, why is it that Jews perhaps seem less interested in worship practice than others? So who would like to take a shot at this? Michael?
Just kind of one notion. It seems to me that Jews bought into modernity more than probably anybody else. And you could explain that as, this is it was a kind of clear choice. Like, you could stay in the ghetto and have limited economic opportunities and be persecuted, or you could get out and be part of the modern world. So guess which one we chose. And with that comes all the kind of notions that come with modernity that challenge traditional beliefs, challenge the otherworldliness of religions. So, Kaplan, for instance, moves away from this notion of salvation afterlife. And I think all those things And so Jews bought into modernity, into science, into kind of rationality, and more than other people. And I'm far from a historian of Islam, but it seems particularly Islam, as we see now, which is why it's a somewhat different story than Christianity, kind of didn't have the same experience of modernity as Christianity and Judaism, as the Europeans and Americans did. So I think that is part of why, not so much compared to Islam, but certainly even compared to Christians in America, Jews are less engaged in prayer. It's just a much more foreign, and that's probably where I came to it. It is I don't think, despite all the reasons that others suggested to keep the past, and I'm not saying we should reject the past, but I don't think it's gonna work. I don't think we're going back. I don't think the Jewish people. I mean, maybe some small segments, but I don't think the liberal Jewish community is going back to an earlier world. It's all a question of kind of juggling these different factors. And let me stop there.
We're going to pass the mic down, Council to you next. Please do try to do me a favor, engage my basic question, if you will. Do you really care, say, about the numbers of votes? Is there some goal to get people to daven, or is that not as important? Say, I would argue Hebrew literacy is clearly important. I would argue studying rabbinic text for all sides of sorcery is clearly important. I don't find myself able to make the same argument, or the same kind of argument for the importance of davening practice, but I thought sort of want to hear you.
So just to speak really quickly, I fundamentally disagree, Dan. I think prayer as a reflection of spirituality is an essential aspect of Judaism. For me, at least, Judaism is a religion. It's about spirituality. It's not just people. It's not just study. It's not just tikkun olam. It's all those things. But I think what makes Judaism is an aspect of spirituality.
I just want to make one quick sociological addendum. When the concentration of Christians who pray is partly a function of the fact that you can stop being Christian. So if you don't want to pray and you don't want to be attached, you can detach yourself. Whereas Jews remain Jewish, and what you may mean by that is that you eat bagels and watch Woody Allen movies, but you identify as a Jew. So.
I agree that if we want to create a Judaism without God, without the connection with Kadosh Baruch Hu, with our Creator, without a sense of which it's at the center and at the core, I think what it means to be Jewish, if we eliminate prayer, we're doomed as a people.
I have 3 responses, but no answer. So let me, I want to share the 3 responses. One is, Zalman Schachter used to tell this story, that he was in Chicago and visiting with a Sufi master. And the Sufi master said, you're a rabbi. I must tell you, Jews are a very spiritual people. So Zalman was very interested. The Sufi master saying something about Jews being spiritual. The Sufi master, so Zalman says, why do you say that? The Sufi master says, well, you go to the yoga, they're Jews. You go to meditation, they're Jews. You go to the Zen master, they're Jews. Jews are very spiritual people. The second thing I want to, I think there was a moment in Jewish history where we skipped a beat, where we weren't able to transmit to a younger generation a sense of the spirituality of Judaism. We were caught up in a rationalist ethic. We were caught up with a kind of preaching from the New York Times. We were caught up in a lot. We were caught up in becoming American. We were, and we missed a beat. And you know, on my campus, the woman who teaches Catholicism was born Jewish and converted. And at one point she said to me, if I had known you when I was a child, I might not have done that. You know, so it's like we missed a beat. The second thing I want to say is I think prayer and liturgy is very difficult and very complex. And if I want to introduce a Jew, a fellow Jew, to Jewish spirituality, I tell them to make Friday night dinner. You know, do Shabbos, light candles, just light candles. Do it without a bracha. Do it with a bracha. Light candles, and the candles will glow, and something will happen to you. So the first step Jewishly back for those wanting to discover Jewish spirituality, I don't believe can take place liturgically. The third thing I want to say is that prayer is very complex. Jewish prayer is complex, partly because Jewishly everything is intertextual. And there's so many related concepts here. And you know, what is it to open up a Siddur and talk about redemption and talk about the... So you have to, if you're going to be introduced to Jewish prayer, you have to do exactly what you were talking about, which is a lot of exercise, a lot of, you do a little by a little by a little, and something begins to add up.
Next question is, can you write silence into the Siddur? I mean, how do we get at it? It's an issue been raised several times, both at our Shabbaton preceding this conference and here, about, this is particularly an issue, but not exclusively in liberal Judaism, I think, about reintroducing, I guess, both silence and private, serious private prayer into the service.
Let others say, but I just got to say one joking response. It's not a joke, though. You know, we're now editing a new conservative prayer book, Siddur Lev Shalem, which will be out in November with the help of the broken Shekhinah. And you know, we have pages. We try to keep one prayer to a page, and that means that there's a lot of white space sometimes. And our publisher keeps on saying, why do you have so much white space? You know? And the white space is the silence.
Well, what do you call the silent Amidah then, if not silence? You know, it's already there.
I think it's a practice question more than a liturgy question.
Yeah, but that is a space that's provided, you know, unless silence has to be Buddhist meditation, you know, which some people may prefer to do. In another sense, I think that the less you interrupt the davening with all sorts of novelties. I mean, I know there's a wide range of opinion in this room on that question, but, you know, I think the less you interrupt, the more latitude you give the davener to think whatever he or she wants. You know, who's monitoring them? If God is monitoring them, God probably would rather have them attach personally in some way than follow every word. Not that I know.
Yeah, I think, and I think Catherine and I may not be in agreement on this. I think that part of the challenge is that kind of, was alluded to earlier, that kind of skip generation. I think many people in synagogue wouldn't know what to do with the silence, just as, as kind of important experience at SAJ, one of my most thoughtful members came up to me and said, well, what are you supposed to do? Like, the cantor or you start a prayer and then there's some time and then you finish. Like, what are you supposed to do in between? Like, so I said, and this was like the thoughtful person going, I said, well, you're supposed to say the prayer. And he said, well, I don't know. He said, just say in English. And he said, yeah, I don't know what I'm supposed to do there. Like, so what often is called Davinology, this kind of style, which I grew up Orthodox, it was kind of to me, that's how prayer happened. I think in liberal synagogues, many people don't know what to do. And therefore, when I first was kind of leading, like I didn't want to interrupt, right? I didn't want to interrupt the flow. And one of Zalman's interesting innovations was to chant the page numbers, right? And, and it would be great if I didn't have to announce pages, but I know in my synagogue, no one would know, most people wouldn't know where we were, right? So I actually think that we need to help teach people, create the experience for people, guide people, but to do that in a way that also leaves space. And in some ways, silence is the best because, I can't tell you what to think. I can only create, the mood. I can introduce, silence. And at SIJ at first, like, you could see people bristle if I said, let's just, I didn't use the word meditate. I learned not to use that word. So let's just sit for a couple minutes in silence. And some of it became, as people got used, so some of it's getting used to it. Some of it is creating what I would again say is kind of spiritual experiences. And that comes, the question is, how do you do that? That's part of what we all struggle with.
Okay, I wish we could go on longer. We have one more question. Is this for Rabbis Strassfeld and Matalon, or either who would like to respond? It's a private, personal question. Outside of the services you lead and are otherwise involved in your professional roles, the questioner would like you to say a couple words about your own prayer practice.
Huh?
You have the prayer practice.
I do have a prayer practice. So some of my practice is sometimes individual prayer, and sometimes I like to go to other places. I am originally a Syrian Jew, so it's a different type of prayer experience in Sephardic synagogues, in North Africa and Middle Eastern synagogues. It's a different dynamic of the service. It's a different type of spirituality. It's connected, of course, with the fact that the spirituality grew within the spirituality, or connected to the Islamic spirituality. So there are elements that are borrowed or that are, came in from the environment, and the dynamic is different. The music is different. I was on sabbatical in Jerusalem a few years ago, and I visited a number of different synagogues. I took the opportunity. I was in a neighborhood that was very, very rich with Sephardic services, North African, Persian, Iraqi, Syrian, and so on. And I spent some time trying to absorb the dynamic of the prayer, of the tefillah there, and it was very rich. Very layered. The texture is different, and so when I go to such places to experience a different type of.
You daven daily?
Of course, yes.
I don't. I don't daven daily, but and it's a disappointment to my own life. And now that I'm about to retire, I wonder whether, I can do some things that I didn't before. But I just want to pick up for a second what Rolly said earlier in terms of prayer is a practice. Like all practices, you can't do it once in a blue moon. Our great challenge is, as liberal congregations, not in the Orthodox world, but in liberal congregations, people come at best once a week. So it's very hard to have a practice which you only do once a week. You couldn't learn a language that way, like Hebrew school, etc., right? And so the question is what you do with that. There are various attempts to, including the Institute for Jewish Spirituality, is trying to encourage notions of daily prayer. But I'm kind of, my approach has always been to try and make the richness of Judaism accessible to as many people as possible. I think that's kind of reflected in my life work. And so I'm dealing with the reality that most Jews are only going to come at best on Shabbat, and how do I create the experience for them in that kind of setting?
I think, can I, one quick thing is, I think it's also important that we allow people to have an experience, if they can't come to shul on a daily basis, at least to have to give them the tools, to give people the tools to do it at home, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, half an hour, 10 minutes, something, a moment of connection, but we have to be able to give people the tools of how to do it, what to say, in what order, and with what intention, so that people can do it. People do yoga at home, and they do all sorts of things in front of the TV, and they do exercises because they don't have time to go to the gym, so why can't we do this with davening? And I think it's a challenge, but it's doable.
Great. So with that, we are going to close. I want to thank our panelists for a wonderfully stimulating presentation. Okay, now, before